Hated and feared in equal measures, Cazadors are the bane of all wanderers in the Mojave wasteland. Incredibly swift, dangerous, and near impossible to sneak past, it's no surprise they're some of the top predators of the deserts, and only really play second fiddle to deathclaws and supermutants. But their huge size may cost them some of the initial ecology that made their tiny ancestors so feared, and it may be the humble bloatfly who has taken the reins of some of their characteristic behaviours. As a quick introduction and backstory, Cazadors are mutated tarantula hawk wasps, and seemingly the species Pepsis grosser. Along with night stalkers, they were created in the Big Mountain Research Facility by Dr. Boros, who did not seem sound of mind, considering his reasoning for preserving the DNA of the assorted Mojave species was solely for his own gene splicing experiments, primarily to make feral supermonsters he later tried to insist were harmless. The Pepsis genus seemed of particular interest to him, and despite his claimed love of dogs that presumably also led to the Night Stalkers, Big Mountain had its own designated Pepsis lab as its star facility, the Z14 Pepsin DNA Splicing Lab. From here the Cazadors were made, and then escaped to colonize the southern deserts of the wasteland despite claims of them being sterile. Bloatflies have a far less intriguing backstory, and are simply believed to be mutated horseflies that, like many insects in the aftermath of the Great War, grew considerably and developed several noticeable physical mutations. The Enclave suggests them to be of the genus Tabanus, which has several hundred species, all of which still count as horseflies. Perhaps the big difference between Cazadors and their natural ancestors is that it doesn't seem Cazadors do the whole spider hunting / tarantula hawking thing, which is what they're so famous for. For a start, the Mojave doesn't seem to have any spiders big enough. This isn't referenced at any point, and in some locations Cazador eggs can be found. So can Cazadors replace it with something else? And why would they? And maybe. To shed some light on this behaviour, it's known as Offspring Provisioning, and is seen in a lot of wasp species across the world. It's not just spiders, though they are a common prey, and other wasp species will use prey like ants or caterpillars as food for their young. As the prey these wasps are famous for catching is for their offspring, not really for themselves, and there are multiple ways of doing it. Mass provisioning with single prey is the best known, and is the one the Cazador ancestor uses, which is to get one huge prey item for a single offspring to eat until it reaches adult stage. There's also mass provisioning with multiple prey, where numerous smaller prey items are selectively harvested into a larder for the hatched offspring to start eating when it's born. And then there's simultaneous progressive provisioning, where the eggs are laid in different locations and the mother brings food to the growing young as they mature. Perhaps more like a bird if the chicks are in multiple locations and don't need feeding quite so frequently. The disadvantage is, if you die, your crop of offspring will also starve. Whereas with mass provisioning, once you've done the shopping, the kids are good to go with or without you. So it could be possible Cazadors haven't completely abandoned mass provisioning. It could be that they've swapped from a single prey mass provisioning system to a multiple prey mass provisioning. The wasteland may not have a Goldilocks species of being just right in terms of mass, edibility, and ease of capture like tarantulas for Pepsis wasps. It could be tempting to posit giant rad scorpions in this category, and maybe Cazadors have shifted from one arachnid to another. But whilst they have sufficient meat, the armour of the rad scorpion could be too big a challenge. In mud dauber wasps, the mothers multiple prey provision their offspring with a variety of different spider species, and actually selectively provide the different species at different stages in the offspring's growth. Certain species are avoided for early instar larvae due to them having integument that's too thick for the offspring to bite through, and so rad scorpions could potentially be too well armoured for young Cazadors to eat their way in or out of, as well as being pretty serious opponents for the adults to handle as well. So perhaps Cazadors harvest small prey like geckos, bloatflies and dogs, among other things, to take back to a lair for the eggs. One potential target could be the ants of the wasteland, large enough to be a reasonable meal if you grab a few of them, and both numerous and sedentary in population enough to be a reasonably reliable resource. Ants could often find themselves as a principal prey. Some digger wasps will utilise certain ant species as their only source of offspring provisioning, so there's precedent for Cazadors to branch into this menu choice. It could also be that Cazadors are a mix of different wasp species from the lab name too. Overall, whilst it's hard to say how much of Cazadors was made in a lab and why, and how much of them may have evolved out further in the wastes, other species can have their impacts, and it could actually be possible bloatflies had a hand in changing Cazador breeding. Female potter wasps provision their offspring with caterpillars, but this can sometimes hit a snag. A smaller social parasitic wasp, Capidosoma primulum, will often lay its own eggs on the same caterpillars, and then this can bungle things for both species. The potter wasp larvae get a caterpillar that's half eaten when they hatch, and the C. primulum offspring are trapped in the potter wasp mud nest that ultimately becomes their tomb. The potter wasps tend to select for pre-parasitized caterpillars as they appear larger and are more lethargic, thus are easier to catch and ultimately more tempting baby food. It's not always a washout for the potter wasps, but they can rear substandard, poorly developed offspring due to this parasitism. Sometimes potter wasp young eat the parasites too, but these are generally believed to be a lower quality food. So if Cazadors ever did find an ideal host for provisioning, it may have since been evolutionarily abandoned due to the bloatflies muscling in on it too. An animal preoccupied with fighting off bloatflies' own larvae would be easier to catch for a Cazador. And with their relatively swift flight, it could even be that bloatflies could lay eggs on the prone prey being carried off by Cazadors too. The incredible prevalence of bloatflies in the wastes could have made this an unavoidable cost to Cazadors, prompting a change in behaviour. In some ways, bloatflies could have partially replaced Cazadors with the offspring provisioning behaviour. The projectiles they fire at the player are in fact their own maggots, coupled with a neurotoxin to immobilize the prey and let them feed. Humans, luckily, seem partially immune to this for one reason or another, but bloatflies may take better advantage of the smaller prey resource, and monopolize it far more efficiently for reproduction than Cazadors, that led to their ubiquitous presence across the lower 48, compared to the far more limited distribution of the Cazadors. The adults themselves seem to have changed their more sanguine diets from their horsefly ancestors, now no longer possessing the scissor-like mouthparts of the base Tabanus family. It's hard to say what exactly the adults feed on with these mouthpieces, but it could be early assumptions were more accurate than first thought, and they feed primarily on soft, rotten carcasses. Depending on if and how severely bloatflies parasitize Cazadors, it could even prompt them into progressive provisioning. Some flies will follow wasps back to their nests to parasitize their prey with their own offspring, which is definite bloatfly energy. But wasps that use progressive provisioning and thus bring more food over a long period of time will have larvae more resistant to such strategies, as it'll be a stream of food rather than a lump sum the parasites can eat before the young even hatch. So Cazadors may no longer be dedicated tarantula hunters, but they may still be terrors of the wastes to many things smaller than them for offspring provisioning, no matter which tactic they use for it. It's unknown what they got spliced with at Big Mountain, but it could be Dr. Boros made a big mix of different wasps to create the Cazadors with a concurrent mix of different behaviours too. So if the Cazadors aren't necessarily always after the courier and companions to lay eggs in them, then why are they always so aggressive? And there could be a few reasons for this. One could be something of a blanket excuse of radiation. In some of the Enclave research in Fallout 3, it mentions in the feral dogs the radiation has apparently caused neural changes that cause aggression. So for some wasteland wildlife, this could partially explain why they're always after your blood. The other two reasons may be more to do with behaviour. Interestingly, real-life Cazadors, the Pepsis genus, seem capable of learning. When Pepsis wasps hunt spiders, they get better, swifter and more efficient at it the more practice they get. So it's suggested they may not just be meat robots operating on autopilot, and it could be that Cazador aggression is learned, as tarantula or hawk behaviour with prey handling may be learned too. At the considerable risk of taking Dr. Boros's word for anything, he does seem to believe the Cazadors as safe, innocent animals, and tarantula hawks, along with other spider-hunting wasps, are actually regarded as pretty calm animals uninterested in people that only sting when severely harassed. After their initial escape from Big Mountain, Cazadors may have been uninterested in people, but were then shot at due to either raiders being raiders, or because they're massive, evil-looking insects in a wasteland full of massive, evil-looking insects that have a rich history of trying to kill you. Negative human experiences could have taught Cazadors to go on the offensive and eliminate such threats, and now the whole population just attacks humans on sight. The other reason may be hydration. When capturing tarantulas for their young, Pepsis wasps will often drink from the dripping wound site after stinging them. The chance of this increases a lot with the amount of time the wasp has spent flying, Understandably so, as spider hunting and tracking is pretty thirsty work in the arid deserts. Hemolymph from the spider not only provides just water, but likely some nutrients for the wasp too. So this may be one reason why the Cazadors attack, being much larger animals with arguably greater needs, and in perhaps the more punishing environment of the Mojave wasteland that may have a greater heat stress potential and less food. Cazadors may well pick off anything they come across to quench their thirst. Mammal blood is still a good source of water, and humans in general are pretty good sources of it. Our iron-rich blood may also have assorted minerals and nutrients the Cazadors can make good use of too. So Cazadors may not be after people to eat them so much as to drink them. Real-life tarantula hawks eat mainly pollen and nectar, and whilst these resources may be present to some extent in the Mojave, it could also be possible more of their diet is now made up of assorted proteins. Some features of Cazadors may well be due to heat and the greater susceptibility of a car-sized insect to it than an insect-sized insect. Unlike modern tarantula hawks, Cazadors actually build nests, not unlike those of many birds. The nests seem to be made of sticks arranged in a shallow bowl in sufficient size to house an adult Cazador. Unlike paper or vespular wasps, there is little modification done, and the Cazadors don't chew the available wood into paper, but they do seem to adhere the nests to rock surfaces with a secretion presumably. Much of this may stem from the base Pepsis species, which are also somewhat heat intolerant. The females hunt primarily at dawn and dusk, taking cover in the heat of the day. Whilst Cazadors are random encounters and can happen at any time in game, the behaviours present, their large size and their base species, may all suggest a similar activity pattern with diurnal/crepuscular behaviour, and a general dislike for the hottest parts of the day too. Nest building may have arisen from the aggregations of tarantula hawks, who will gather in small groups to avoid the heat of the day. Being so large, Cazadors may struggle to find shade, and rather wound up building their own whilst in such aggregations, giving rise to the nest sites. In many ways, tarantula hawks were well poised to become both megafauna and terrors of the wasteland. For wasp standards, they're comparatively long-lived, and by most standards they're very well defended. Their armour is very tough and very smooth, with descriptions showing tarantulas defending themselves as struggling to grip it, to then properly pierce it, which translates well into their giant equivalents shrugging off melee weapons and small arms fire when attacking the courier and companions. Even without the stinger, the strong spiked forelimbs make for good melee weapons too. But how may Cazadors interact with the other denizens of the wasteland outside of potential prey? Interestingly, night stalkers are often described as fighting with Cazadors over prey, despite their comparatively smaller size. Being chiefly nocturnal as their name suggests, these interactions presumably occur at dawn and dusk, when the night stalkers are coming back from the night shift and the Cazadors are heading out on the morning forage, or vice versa. It's also surprising the two fight, as tarantula hawk venom is insanely painful for true mammals, viewed as incapacitating and perhaps the second most painful sting. The venom only functions in the epidermis and the upper tissues of the body, and doesn't actually have much of an effect intravenously. Overall, it's actually pretty non-toxic, but it is pretty damaging to the courier when they're stung by Cazadors, so maybe this has changed, or it's so intensely painful with mutation that the mental and/or cardiovascular effects of such pain can actually kill the courier if not rapidly treated. But for the night stalkers, maybe either snakes have some resistance to the venom, or Dr. Boros, who also made the night stalkers, engineered all of his creations to play nice with one another, and made them immune to each other's respective venoms. It's testament to the night stalkers that they hold their own against the Cazadors, and seemingly have a mix of natural toughness, good weaponry, and presumably superior social cohesion that allows them to stalemate the larger and similarly numerous Cazadors. Cazadors are too large, venomous, and well-armoured to be accosted by the lower rank and file of other wasteland predators, but they're still possibly vulnerable to death claws. As publications note, tarantula hawks are very well-defended insects, and other than very rare tarantula predation, only birds seem successful in taking them on. As things engineered as weapons with an immense pain tolerance to the point of dragging themselves on broken limbs, deathclaws may well be immune or unbothered by Cazador venom. Cazadors may still potentially defend themselves with social behaviour and/or other chemical defences. Tarantula hawks in groups secrete a noticeable odour. Singly, a deathclaw may well predate a Cazador, but upon trying to enter a nest site it may well be beset by enough musk and harassment from the swarm, it tries a less well-armed meal. So despite the differences Cazadors have grown from their small beginnings, many of the unique features of the tarantula hawk wasp still ring true in them across the wasteland. To quote Justin Schmidt's paper on them, one measure of biological success is the ability of an organism to feed its young well, to avoid being fed upon by other organisms, and to live a long life, usually terminated by old age. By these standards, tarantula hawks exemplify biological success, and thusly so do Cazadors, like it or not. To talk a little on the design and general thoughts on the Cazadors, they were first created by Joshua Sawyer along with all the new enemies seen in Fallout New Vegas. Sawyer believed the games lacked a serious high-level bug monster, which is a little odd considering giant rad scorpions, and especially Broken Steel's monstrously powerful albino ones. Like many, I dreaded seeing Cazadors, and was slaughtered or wounded by them many times in the lower levels of New Vegas. But despite the certainly warranted loathing felt by much of the fanbase, it also can't be denied New Vegas really wouldn't have been the same without them. The lethal threat of early game Cazadors gave just about every player a unified common experience to share. Whilst Cazadors are scarcely changed other than size from Pepsis Grocer, the tarantula hawk is already such a lethal looking insect with the iridescent blue body and orange wings, it really didn't need much adding. As well as that, giant bugs are a traditional sci-fi enemy, and especially an important part of the campy 50s cinema and culture pastiche Fallout has always gone for. Whilst the Cazadors haven't returned since, and they definitely don't need to be in every game, it would be nice to see them get a graphical facelift, and see them again in an updated desert Fallout. The bloatflies pretty much are a staple, and work relatively well as the weird, ugly and typically Fallout first enemy to harass the player. They're never going to be much more outside of comedy variants, but then they don't really need to be either. They're just bloatflies. Thanks for watching, and thanks to top patrons Phenomenon and the Superist Duper for their continued support for the channel, as well as patrons Kate Sandom, Big Al, Eringar Steiny, Flyguns Archives, Hui, Original Username, Inventory Overflow, Tristan Berry, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Seth Fake Last Name, Zaysir, Carazol, Dodecablos, and Bazugazu Bakumatsu for their ongoing generosity. There's a link provided in the description for any who can join up too, and any amount is always appreciated. So this isn't the original video slated for this time slot either. That video has since been shelved as I wasn't happy with the actual body of evidence supporting the point I wanted to make, even if I think that point is still true. But it may be able to be used in a later video somehow. This one was made instead as the Deathclaw video was pretty well received, and people seemed keen for more Fallout content. So why not explore the Cazadors and how like or unlike tarantula hawks they actually are. Thanks for all the comments and suggestions on the last video too. I was pretty rightly called out for not featuring bugs in it, especially with the literature on them and their horns. And there was also a demand for tusks too, so maybe at some point I'll have to do a cranial ornamentation part 2 video. A lot of people did mention pterosaurs too, though pterosaur crests I don't think are very analogous to horns to be mentioned alongside them, but we'll have to see if crests can be included in the aforementioned potential sequel. Next time we'll be back to Monster Hunter, so see if you can figure out who'll be covered.